Hello and welcome to Questioning Mind. Today it is my pleasure to be joined by Shorjoe, who is a very good friend, and he is somebody who's had a lot of experience in several different very futuristic, very technology-oriented spaces. He writes on technology now. He is a blogger and has a daily blog as well. He is going to start his own podcast, which deals with a very niche subject space of security technology. And he's had a lot of experience with logistics in China and India, and basically has started the global logistics space for goods and procurement and supply chain and logistics for at a global scale for corporates, large scale corporates and conglomerates. So, Shorjoe, it is my pleasure to have you on the show today, and I really look forward to this conversation.
Happy to be here. It's a pleasure to be here also. Thank you for inviting me.
Shorjoe has been working in India for a bit, but he's an American citizen who's got experience working in Shanghai. And is there anywhere else in the logistics space that you worked in apart from China and India?
I've also worked in the U.S. in the heart of Texas and done some logistics there also, where U.S. manufacturing was there when we were producing gears for cars. So that was the third area also.
Well, all of the spaces are very specific, and I'd be very interested in knowing, how they tie into a larger ecosystem and basically how the world space is looking in terms of logistics and supply chain. And I understand that the Indo-Pacific region has a lot to contribute in this space because it's got a lot more work to be done as well, and still it's progressed pretty rapidly in that area. So, Shorjoe, I'd love your views first on the logistics space, but I'd also like to move on to your interest in working in India specifically, and your experiences as an American Hindu, and what you find in India, what you take back from it, and basically your connect with India at this time. Is that something you'd want to walk us through as well later?
Sure. I can start off with that actually, if that is fine with you.
Okay.
So I actually ended up coming to India in 2017, and I moved from the suburban U.S. From the state of Texas in Dallas directly into the largest port in India, which is a port called Mundra, which handles the most containers of the country and handles a significant amount of dry cargo also. So Mundra is an extremely rural town. It's a heavily industrial town, and it was quite an eye-opening experience because you move from suburban U.S. where there's an median annual income of $112,000 to a small town called Mundra where it's a hub for only transporters. And we all know transporters is one of the most on-ground industries in India that really exists. The transportation industry where drivers are there, and there's thousands of drivers, thousands of laborers who are just going around and just doing logistics and moving goods and all. So that's been an eye-opening experience actually, because that itself really gave me a feel of what the real India really is, how the real Indian logistics industry moves right from ground zero as a whole. Because to really see and understand logistics, how the goods move, you have to be in the field, because the industry, all the action happens in the field. You have to see how the papers move from hand to hand. You have to see how the goods get unstuffed. You have to see how laborious and challenging the process is. And you really have to see why the world today is in a supply chain crisis, because the physical goods have to move. It's not like just information you can send it across. If the goods don't move, everything else stops. So that insight really came in from moving to India, being on ground zero, and the American point of view brought an even greater insight because you saw another way to do things. So that added one more lens that I really never had before to see how to do things better, really.
So, in terms of the volume that you've worked with, how is it different, and what are the differences that you saw in the American space and in India?
So, I mean, in terms of if I have to compare maybe two roles, the American space of volume, it is much more structured in terms of what they're trying to achieve. It doesn't mean they're more efficient. It looks efficient because they're formalized all the steps. It's formalized in that, but they're not able to handle disruptions as well. In India, the beauty is that they're able to handle disruptions really, really well. Exception handling is the norm here because you're always having a labor shortage, you're always having a truck accident, you're always having these things happening. So the ability to handle exception disruptions, India is a great country. Firefighting is something that India does really, really well, especially in logistics, because the goods do get delayed, but they do eventually get delivered as a whole. So in the US, I found that they have all the steps in place, but when the crisis hits, like it's hitting now, the supply chain crisis where there was a container shortage, the US in a lot of ways wasn't able to really keep up. The containers piled up, the ports got jammed up, and there was no alternate port that they created really as a way. If you look in the Indian part of the world, in the subcontinent, the vessels never really backed up here like it was. In the US, the waits in Los Angeles were going like 10, 20 days. In India, it never crossed 3, 4 days as a whole. So the ability to take action and really step up and bring their game when the fire hits, India is really able to have a resilience to come back and really get the logistics back under control.
All right, you mentioned paperwork, right? And with resilience and disruption management, do you think that the paperwork in India is, it's still extremely, it's got a lot of red tape and it's a little slow in terms of processing as compared to the rest of the world?
It definitely is. It definitely is because the physical copy, of course, plays a very important role in India because customs and all these different stakeholders all need the physical copy to move. So that red tape does make it to slow the process down as a whole. But if you look at it, the paperwork itself in terms of digitization in India is really evolving. There's a lot of new companies that have come in to the space that is taking all the main paperwork like the bill of lading and the commercial invoice, and they're taking and making them digitized over time. So if you look, the acceleration from physical to digital is happening because the startup ecosystem is also ballooning. And soon I think we will match the US in terms of efficient paper handling, even in logistics.
Well, that's a very optimistic take because we constantly hear these things about digitization in India being a problem, especially logistics also is a problem. And I think apart from a couple of organizations, really large conglomerates, I don't know if the logistics space is evolving as quickly as is necessary, perhaps, because even in India, the standard for any startup attempting to enter the space is basically we're the Uber of this and the Uber of that. So basically, Uber is the gold standard, even for internal movement of trucks. Whether it's interstate or intrastate, anything, or intracity even. So the attempt is an aggregation and basically a formalization and a tracking system. But apart from that, would you have any insights into how that space is progressing?
Yeah, I have a lot of insight. So I actually have worked closely with many startups actually in this space, in India specifically. So we all know the US has its own Flexports of the world and all these companies. But if you look at the unicorn space in India, the unicorn space in India, in logistics specifically, is evolving. I mean, Delivery is there, Blackbuck is there in a lot of ways. Those are the flagship ones that exist. But more than that, what's really happening really, really effectively in India in terms of logistics is the startups here are actually doing both. They're doing execution and they're doing tech as a whole. And that is unique because in the US, most of the logistics startups that upcoming, they do tech, but they don't do execution, meaning they don't do the physical operations, which really limits them. So by doing both, you get an upper hand in eating your own dog food and accelerating your way to getting better as a whole. So that itself is one of the main reasons, since they do both, is the reason why I think in India, the logistics unicorn revolution is coming, because there will be a lot of log tech startups that do come in because they're doing both. They're in the execution and they're also trying to optimize. So if I give an example, in when containers, for example, intermodal 20-foot, 40-foot shipping containers are very, very common in moving goods. So they're standard containers and all. So there's a lot of startups in India. What they're doing is they're doing something called a street turn. So a street turn is when a 20-foot container comes in or a 40-foot container comes in, they want to turn that import and export it out immediately from the same factory that it's unloaded in. They wanted to restuff cargo and just put it out as export. So basically this helps optimize the flow of the container so it doesn't spend time inside the country. So there's a lot of startups in India that's pushing for that. In the US, they've really not harnessed and succeeded in that. If India succeeds in doing that, India will have a huge export advantage because the logistics cost goes dramatically down because you're wasting less empty miles.
That's a very good insight. I honestly had no idea about that aspect. Is there any other country? You said US is not doing it as optimally. Is there any other country that it has succeeded in pushing for that quick turnaround?
So I mean, most countries don't really succeed because the import export imbalance is really high in most
Right.
countries. The U.S. is import heavy, China is export heavy. The beauty of India is when it comes to containers specifically, India actually has quite a balanced container import export, nearly 54-46 from a ratio
Wow.
standpoint, which means that there's a lot of balance, a lot of opportunity to turn containers around actually as a whole.
Mhm, mhm. That's that's uh that's good news for India. And apart from the cities, I know that NCR, Delhi NCR, and Bangalore have a lot of these startups coming up in the logistics space. I know Blackbuck delivery that you mentioned, Porter. Porter, I think, is Mumbai based, but a lot of these startups are based in these metro cities. Do you see this going outside of the metro cities and coming in spaces where it's not so crowded in the startup space? Do you see logistics happening, making use of the rural backlog in terms of development?
I think so. I think two of the startups I would like to highlight that I think will absolutely should be highlighted and others will copy them is Elastic Run and Udan. So Elastic Run
Right.
is a startup that's really rocking the space in terms of creating the infrastructure, the actual railroad to connect with the rural space. So they say rural first, forget the metro. So we're going to be the first ones to pioneer a brand new route from somewhere like a metro directly to a village in Pune or a village somewhere in Maharashtra. So I do think that the rural revolution is coming. I think it's been a bit slow, but there are pioneers that's just putting the tracks down to make it happen. So there are companies that will absolutely take it, and now is the time to really get in the rural logistics space because formalization of goods is really picking up now. So people in the rural areas all want formal rice, packed rice. They don't want loose rice anymore. So because the
Right.
demand is going up, these kind of startups will definitely now take shape because companies like Elastic are already there, and now it's all about just copying their model and scaling it up. Really,
This is about the transport. Cold chain is another part of the logistics supply chain that is not really. It's taken root only in very specific items and very specific areas, regions as well. So, is that what is the development in that area when it comes to India rural bringing rural goods to cities, but also exporting them and taking them to the ports and all of that. The comprehensive supply chain that goes into cold chain, storage, warehousing, then transport, all of that. Are there any sort of, whether it's only tech, even if there's a tech organization that is attempting to connect all of these dots, is there any breakthrough there?
I think cold chain is the last industry that actually has not really had that breakthrough because the cold chain is heavily infrastructure driven. And because of the lack of infrastructure really in place, it's hard to overcome that. Most of the industry, you can overcome infrastructure fault lines by using optimization technology and using deflationary pricing. But cold chain, if you don't have a warehouse that can keep the food cold, if you don't have reefer containers that'll keep the goods cold on en route, if you don't have the railroad that'll go and keep the rail line that will keep the food cold when it's going, it makes it really difficult. So cold chain itself, I think there has to be significant amount of investment through government policy that really does make the cold chain industry wake up. So that is still one industry I do see that the focus is coming because cold chain is high value logistics, but I still have not seen the infrastructure industry to pick up and do cold chain more efficiently.
You said government policies. What specifically would help the cold chain development?
So I think that there's a farm law that if I remember correctly is they don't let farmers stock additional goods for X amount of time. They don't let them hoard and store additional goods because they want to quickly sell them. If I don't remember the law completely in that case. But because of the inability to store excess goods, the infrastructure never really comes up because there's no need for the infrastructure because they have to dump the goods before you go out and you even use the infrastructure. So because of the lack of utilization of those goods, because the government doesn't allow excess goods to be stored, that's one of the reasons why I see cold chain logistics not really picking up.
Right. It's an interesting point because I know we grew up in times where hoarding was an actual problem, and sellers, middlemen sellers, and black marketers would actually allow perishable items and grains to rot rather than either give them away even fairly to ration shops or sell them for a fair price. So it's interesting that the exact opposite is the problem now, that because of that inability to store these items, they are unable to get fair prices outside of a particular season for them. So, it's an interesting problem, and I'd like, if anybody's listening in and has a startup idea, as Shorjoe says, this is a good space waiting to be disrupted. So, what in terms of the policy changes, apart from say the farm laws and the storage mechanism, apart from this, what would help push for the cold chain development in India?
I think with the existing infrastructure that is already there are a few players in place. It has a heavy focus on tech. Those players focus on building a marketplace purely for cold chain as a whole. It could help drive a lot of value because there is still a decent amount of volume in India. India does several tens of thousands of containers of cold chain already, and there are some areas that have warehouses in place that are cold chain specific. And with technology coming in, with batteries coming in, and becoming more mobile and all, it is becoming possible to keep areas colder temporarily. So if there's a cold chain specific marketplace that really comes in, that's really niche, would focus on commodities like meat in the cold chain area where they focus on distribution efficiently with whatever that exists, it could work in starting a model that is built on the existing infra. But a lot of players have not gone into it because to tap into such niche marketplaces, you have to really have great sourcing and industry connect, and to see who are the guys who are running in the industry to tap into it. So if someone has that connect, I think now would be the right time to build a cold chain specific marketplace to sell these goods so the infrastructure and the industry develops as a whole.
So yeah, that is the thing, right? Cold chains cannot function as a standalone business because they will need to tap into the logistics pipeline and then have the connects from the sourcing to the selling. So that definitely makes it a pretty hard business to get into. So the business model itself has barriers in place for cold chain development. So in terms of comparison with, say, China, um, where do you think we stand? How far do we have to go in order to match up to their efficiencies, and whether in terms of policy or in terms of execution?
I mean, if you have to look at it, this answer, I think there's really two, three things that are that are going well for us. I think the old day China special economic zone concept is finally really growing on India, in which you have these export sector zones that will take imports, raw materials, and export goods out. So the special economic zone as a policy is doing well in India, and I think that itself is a good way for us to scale up our manufacturing as a whole. The other thing, of course, that China has done phenomenally well that we have not really done well is the infrastructure play. So for us to match China, we really still have to continue to invest in port infrastructure and scale that up, because the Chinese port infrastructure is very, very strong, and that always has helped the logistics. Because if port infra is there, it radically brings down the cost it takes to move goods across the country. If you combine rail line, if you combine ports, it's a very, very strong combination of moving goods across. And China has done both. I think you've seen they have the high-speed rails. They also have ports all around their eastern coast, and that itself has done. So both those are given in that case that we have to do.
All right.
Uh,
I just wanted to sort of ask you because we're discussing China and we know how much they manufacture as well, how industrialized they are. So they definitely utilize those ports to the maximum, utilize the railroads to the maximum. Um, I know that our manufacturing is certainly not really comparable to China at this point, but is that something that is keeping also the infrastructure development a bit of less of a priority for us? Is that something that's affecting us to not have that scale of industrialization? So we don't focus on the infrastructural development.
I think I think it does because there's an old model that exists that people all say with infrastructure founders that say that you build and they will come. So China really followed that model. They built, and really the manufacturing industry is developed as a whole. So unless you have the infrastructure in place from an industrial point of view, it's really hard to overcome that. So if you look in India, there's an interesting way if you look at it. Our clusters are almost all our manufacturing clusters are ending up really at the heartland of the country where there's a metro, where there's infrastructure, where they can either rail it out or they're near ports where they can ship it out. For example, the auto sector is always in South India near Chennai because there's a port there, of course. There's a huge amount of rice and other things that produce like food processing that happens in the north. The farms are there, the rail lines are there, the dry ports so that you can ship it out as a whole. So because the infrastructure is developed really, really well in certain clusters, the manufacturing itself has come up. So I do think that has to come first before really the manufacturing picks up. It's really hard to overcome that unless you find other ways to leapfrog and get other investment from technology and digital products that'll overcome that leap by putting investment into from those companies getting into infrastructure.
That's interesting because most people start to talk about industrialization in India first before addressing the logistics issue as well and the infrastructural issue. I understand that this government at the center has done a lot of work in the infrastructure space, but that is so much more for roads specifically, and that's mainly the first step in connecting the country, the territorial whole of the country. So that's really just step one we've gotten to so far, and maybe a little bit of the metro development, metro city development, and the smart city projects that are coming up. But I suppose that's not really helping as much as it should in terms of infrastructure for export and industrialization. So that's an interesting take. That once the infrastructure development happens, then the industrialization can really pick up speed. So, all right.
Absolutely.
In terms of the comparison with China and the U.S., we've discussed those. But in terms of our standing in the global order, so to speak, and really economic growth, where do you see us with regards to logistics and supply chain? How much more can we contribute to the world, to the space?
So I think
Who should we compare ourselves to, apart from
so,
China?
sorry, can you repeat that question?
Who should we compare ourselves to apart from China?
So I think you would have to divide India up into different regions because we have different strengths across the country. But before I jump into that part, we could just look at the overall metric of where we really stand, sort of sheer potential. So China, of course, everyone knows, does the largest volume in the world in terms of movement. So India does about 17 million containers a year. Our neighbor Sri Lanka does 7 million by themselves. So if you look at this huge potential for India to go out and increase their volume because of that. Now, if we want to go and pick a comparison on who do we really compare ourselves to, the US, of course, has always been the gold standard because they've been a democracy for so long, they've developed industries over the years. China accelerated through manufacturing. So if we really want to compare ourselves, we have to look at two different types of ports. We have to look at our gateway, we look at our transshipment ports as a whole. So there are certain clusters that we have. Yeah, so we have two types. Yeah, we have two types of areas. We should look at gateway clusters and we should look at transshipment clusters as a whole. So the gateway clusters are places like Mundra, places like JNPT in Mumbai, places like Chennai, where you can build a manufacturing hub that could compete with the China Special Economic Zone model as a whole. Beyond China, you don't have to really compare yourself. You could compare yourself with the Koreas of the world and the Taiwans of the world, where they have these clusters also. So we should compare those regions with those parts of the world where they're gateway specific. The other part of the comparison we should do is with the transshipment part, which is places like in Kerala, Vijingam, and other ports, in which you can compare those with the Columbos of the world and the other parts of the world in which you can do transshipment specific comparisons. So if you compare transshipment clusters with parts of the world and then gateway with other parts of the world, you get a better comparison than a country-to-country comparison. Because India, I think, is too diverse to do a direct country-to-country comparison because it's very unique in how it's structured compared to the U.S. or even China or any other country.
All right. I had no idea about the different kinds of ports that we needed to, look into. Apart from manufacturing, you and I have discussed recycling as well offline. So recycling is another aspect where China sort of gained the entire system and did really well for themselves up to a particular time when they had to cut down on their because of the model they were using. So we don't have anything like that at this point. All the recycling that has happened at very small scale, city based with specific power plays in that space with small bits, not small, but businessmen who have their own networks, even political networks, to help them with the space. So, is there what is the development in terms of recycling that's happened in India? Is there any disruption that you see happening? Or what would you hope for in that space? And why? I'd actually like to discuss why this is so important because we've discussed it, but for the audiences, I'd love for your views on why recycling is such an important money maker for the economy and how we can help the world if we tap into this.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to shed some light on that. So, if we go back to, again, we always love to compare with China before we jump into the Indian recycling industry. There's a famous book called Junkyard Planet that I would say is worth reading because that talks about how Chinese recycling was a major industry in developing manufacturing as a whole. So recycling is critical for countries that are very, very gung-ho on manufacturing because they need so much raw material to produce goods in which the virgin materials aren't enough. In India, there's a heavy amount of raw materials that are imported in into the country, whether it's waste paper already, whether it's plastic, whether it's rags that come in, because they need to produce other things domestically as a whole. India itself has a huge amount of domestic consumption that's generating so much waste as a whole. So because domestic consumption is rising as a whole, it means that to even cater to the internal demand, you have to find a way to have alternate goods to produce these finished goods, whether it is waste paper that's turned into finished cardboard boxes, or waste paper that's finished into food cartons and all. So recycling as a whole is the best way to do that. Otherwise, you have to keep cutting trees and other sources to do that. Now, the challenge with recycling is how do you really build a processing center as a whole, because it requires heavy investment to do it as a whole. Now, the best way to do that is you need to go out and combine really three elements into it. This is my perspective. This may not be right at all, but this is just an opinion I have. If you can combine an ability to source from external markets that's already importing waste in, if you can build a processing center that can through land, and you can find a demand cluster that'll go and take these materials, you can build a recycling ecosystem that takes raw materials and produces goods at a much cheaper cost than other goods, which itself can push additional manufacturing because you brought down the price point that would otherwise take all this packaging. And with Amazons of the world going up and all these companies going with e-commerce going up, packaging itself is really critical. And recycling is a way to bring down the cost of packaging, which itself can help increase exports and focus on internal demand itself. So I see recycling as something. Yeah, good.
Sorry, you specifically said that we need to bring in goods from the outside as well in order to pump up the volume of recycling within the country. Is that something you mentioned?
I do. See, we're already importing a lot of waste paper. That's already coming in heavily. Waste paper is a big Indian import that's coming in. And I think since we already have an ecosystem to handle waste paper and turning it around into a cardboard box, something else. So if you further increase and build on the ecosystem and you start getting those factories to cater to internal demand as a whole, because the infrastructure is already there, you can further use that additional infrastructure and ramp up the capacity to increase your exports. Because you have the infrastructure in place, you should divert that waste paper from other countries to increase your own exports, because the infrastructure is there, and you will yourself will be creating more jobs to export out more products, because most countries aren't really interested in handling the waste. And waste paper itself is something that's easier to handle compared to other products as a whole for recycling.
All right. You've been an environmental activist for during your
I was,
education
yeah.
during your position. Yes. So as such, you've also seen the damage that overburdening the system caused on China, the actual environmental damage as well as the human crisis that happened due to the fumes and there being no checks and regulations in place to help the people who were working in the recycling system. So as such, typically when we discuss recycling, it's in favor of a greener world and an eco-friendly world. But then when we see that what happened in reality with China is so different from what we imagine it to be, then how do you sort of um, link these two very contradicting ideas, that the theoretically recycling is really great for the planet and for the industries themselves, but in reality it can actually have some damaging impacts as well.
So I think that is true. I mean, there are trade-offs that absolutely exist, but I would like to point out also that the rag picker industry of recycling in India is quite large already. The informal sector that's already doing this sort of recycling informally through manual labor itself is already large. So a lot of this is already happening, and it's causing environmental damage as a whole. So I think formal recycling, it may increase volume as a whole, but it would also formalize the entire sector, and it would help these people who are doing this informally become formal and have the right equipment in place. I also do believe that a country as they're developing would have to go out and make a trade-off as a whole. I think that you can go out and say that right now the environment is very critical, but that would reduce your manufacturing capabilities, which is fine. If you believe you can run a digital economy without manufacturing, you can go out and reduce the need for recycling, increase the need for recycling, but with environmental caution. But if you really want to go out and boost your manufacturing, I think that you would have to make a trade-off in the short run on the environment while formalizing the sector.
Right, so we expect it to have some damaging impacts, but that's a trade-off that we should expect to make, especially if we're going towards a manufacturing and industrialization anyway. So um, I had another question about recycling as a whole. So in terms of paper, you say that we're already importing, and there's systems in place that can just be scaled up, and we'll have potentially a good run of it. When it comes to plastics, though, and other scrap material, even electronic debris, etc. I've read that it's much more expensive to have recycled products as compared to virgin products, especially when it comes to plastic. That
That's true.
they become pellets, and then there's only a certain number of times that such plastic can be used, and eventually it's way more cost effective for organizations to go in for the virgin product. So how do we expect to handle that with recycling? Would a boom in sort of recycling when we import this waste help us overcome those costs?
You can only overcome those costs if you see, in that case, you almost need a founder or entrepreneur who's investing in his second or third startup that has access to capital that can handle that sort of waste with a large factory. You need a large infrastructure play to make that happen. Because if you don't have that in place, there's no way to build the sorting centers that can go out and process those things at a price point that can overcome the virgin price point. So that itself requires, I think, capital investment to build up as a whole. Without, it's not a small scale game. It's someone who understands the details and has access to capital to handle the electronics and all. And I think no one has really figured that out. So that's why we've never really been able to overcome the electronic waste problem really in India.
So I think Japan has done really well on that. I don't know how they overcome the cost ineffective issue, but then they've done pretty well in terms of actually recycling and being very, very sensitive towards environmental needs as well as recycling as a whole, and they have done it in a manner that has the checks and balances that China did not. So, do you have any idea on how that is achieved? I don't think it's volume though there.
No, on Japan, unfortunately, I'm not sure. I've not really read up on the Japanese recycling industry.
Although they do have the capital in place to make that happen, of course, their defense spend have been almost zero
No.
at this point. They have a lot of investment in other areas, including industrialization. So I suppose it can be state sponsored. But all right, moving on from recycling, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of recycling? And if there's any startups in the space, or if there's anything that you have for potential startups in the space, any advice or ideas?
Not much. I think recycling itself is not a space that startups have gone into. I mean, there's large companies, but it's a space that's untapped. There's some environmentalists who've gone and tried it out to sort it out, but they've not had the scale. If there's one startup that I know in Australia, there's a company called TrashCon, actually, that is Bangalore based, that has done some interesting stuff in trying to do processing of waste and other things into recycling as a whole. So that's one company that is worth checking out.
All right. So moving on to decentralized economies. So you have a lot of views, and let me pull up one of the Medium blogs that you wrote some time ago about Meta. Just give me a minute while I bring that up. What are your views on the potential of a decentralized economy, but also decentralized systems as a whole?
So I think that to break that up, I think where the world is heading right now, decentralization. So what happened with the world was everyone in the past wanted to have a decentralized economy because it levels the playing field. It creates less areas where there's really powerful people and there's people. So the gap between the powerful and the not so powerful is where we are now as a whole. So the decentralized economy was something that was supposed to bridge the gap. Until 2008, 2010, the technology never really existed to have a decentralized economy because there was nothing called a blockchain or Bitcoin out there. The blockchain Bitcoin changed that. So it became possible to go out and create decentralized technology that can track something from a transactional point of view where everybody has visibility as a whole. So the decentralized economy, I think, is something that's coming up heavily in the US especially, because decentralized economy and crypto adoption, I think, go hand in hand as a whole. As crypto adopts and becomes more and more popular, as it is with more and more people, the decentralized economy will grow as a whole. And I think that India as a whole is not a country that is yet going decentralized because, of course, our crypto policies are still catching up. Of course, we have the tax of 30% as a whole. But a decentralized economy can really only power through once there is a strong adoption of crypto, because you need a blockchain really to run such an economy in place. You need that underlying technology to run. So the US itself is the world leader of that right now. I think the other countries are catching up once they really adopt crypto and the blockchain as a whole. China, of course, is left aside because China is still heavily centralized, and they're going to try to use blockchain and all because they have these startups that are coming in, but they're going to stay centralized despite having blockchain and a decentralized center coming up.
About this blog, right? You've got meta temples, meta forests, and you have a very lovely article where you mix in your experiences in a more rural part of the country with how the metaverse can actually help bring in a lot of change in that area. We've discussed this in terms of tourism as well. So if there's something that you can explain for the audience as to how Meta can help with tourism, as well as how it can help with generally how it ties into the decentralized economy.
Yeah, so I'll tell you where that concept is. So we had visited a place called Polo Forest, actually, in northeastern Gujarat, actually. So Polo Forest is an outback forest where they have some really, really old temples. And these temples itself are completely untouched as a whole. So the idea behind was that when I saw these temples and I saw that they were really not being maintained properly from a restoration perspective. The idea was that the metaverse really is a place in which you want to recreate experiences. One of the major layers of the metaverse is the experiential layer as a whole. So what we thought was that, or at least I thought was that if such a site exists that is untapped, that's struggling to be maintained as a from a restoration point of view, the metaverse can help take such a site into a digital world where more people can experience it, where funds could be captured because there's more experience, where people experiencing it. You can monetize the area, and you could transfer those funds back into the real world and make the real world an NFT zone where people only come in to visit, pick up NFTs. So the real world area becomes more exclusive, but the digital world becomes democratic, where people could go and visit that area as a whole. So the fund transfer, value transfer from the digital polar forest to the physical polar forest would help save the area so it's restored without depending on the government for restoration funds.
All right, that's very interesting. So even after it's restored, or do you mean that it'll be exclusive only during the restoration process, or do you expect it to remain exclusive in general as an NFT zone?
I would say it would be continuous as a whole. I think because places are exciting as well, and the world is a large place. Even in a digital world, there'll be more and more people who would want to visit these experiential zones who have not experienced it. And if in a digital place, it's also much easier to have the funds to attract tourists, digital tourists, to come and visit these zones as a whole. So I think that sort of competition will happen because digital tourism and the competition to visit these digital attractions will grow, and that itself can fund and create the best places to visit in the digital world, and you can funnel those funds to restore and maintain more areas.
So after they are, restored as such, you do expect some real tourism to happen, and then it just becomes a cycle, or do you prefer that it remain exclusive, and if so, why?
So see, there's two ways to look at it. So the digital world will look exactly the same as a physical world. Where 3D photography is going, 3D visualization is going, everyone can visit digitally as a whole. If you really want to visit the physical world, there has to be a cost to it because you're trying to maintain it for eternity as a whole. That's where the NFTs come in. An NFT itself is an exclusive area as a gateway to go and collect a token that is high value as a whole. So the guys and the people that you really want to visit the physical world has to have some sort of exclusivity so the people who come in are not disrupting the area. It's creating exclusivity so you don't have too much traffic in the physical world because you're trying to maintain the physical world. Because we've seen temples and other places get overrun when they have too many people visiting the area as a whole.
All right, it's a very interesting concept for tourism, and I think this is something that we've discussed in terms of places other than temples as well when it comes to um, ecologically sensitive areas and places like that. So it's a very interesting concept. But in terms of temple visits and us being Indians, I'm not sure that that's going to be taken very
Definitely,
positively.
it's a wild idea. I know people like the physical visits at this age, and it's a wild idea. But let's see. As a dark horse idea, you never know.
In terms of tourism to other areas, I think that's something that can very well take root. But when it comes to places where temples and community areas, temples are typically they evolved as community spaces, and even recently, the chief minister of UP of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, actually made temple visits to Ayodhya without the VIPs being allowed special entry during Ram Navami. So that's typically what used to happen was that there were lots of VIPs who used to take up the space and take up the opportunity to visit the temples at that time, due to which the ordinary people could not really visit it. So it became a little more democratized in that fashion. So in the next 2 days, I think when Ram Navami happens, they will not be allowed to use the VIP spaces, or they will have to go exactly as common people do. So considering that sentiment when it comes to places like temples, I think the metaverse definitely in terms of restoration, and until restoration happens and the history of the place is actually discussed and made available to the people. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I hope it really takes root. Do you have any specific examples of people, of organizations or startups who've attempted this? I saw one where Dalir Mehendi, who has created a metaverse for people to party in, but apart from that, in terms of tourism and actually funneling in the money to the real world, have you seen that
No.
circle?
So I think that itself has not happened because of one reason. The gaming industry is still it's mature already, but it's maturing more because to recreate a zone that exists physically in the metaverse still requires immense amount of effort, because you need artists, you need simulation specialists, you need developers that can go out and recreate. If I give you a statistic, in a lot of gaming companies, each game developer has more than 15 artists that are behind that person. So if you look at that ratio that exists, it makes it tricky to go out and recreate this. So once there's a 3D visualization organization out there that can do this at scale, they do 3D photography at scale, where they can go out and recreate these zones at scale, all these micro details as a whole, it'll become easier to do it because the technology itself has not scaled up, the workflow technology as a whole, and the digital manufacturing process is not scaled up as a whole. So there are companies that are doing it in bits and pieces, but a restoration behemoth that can do 3D visualization itself does not exist yet anywhere in the world.
But it's a brilliant idea. I would love to see it explored, especially because India is home to a lot of very ecologically diverse and sensitive areas, which simply are following a development model that is copied and pasted from countries that do not have the same sensitivity, ecological sensitivity, diversity, or even the climatic conditions are very different. So we just copy and paste the model that is not really suitable for the country, for the regions that they are working in. So this would be a brilliant sort of idea.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to have. I actually thought of this. It was in the digital space, not in the virtual and meta space yet. But then I saw this documentary on Sonali that became very popular. The Discovery documentary on Sonali became very popular, and that's basically a walkthrough of the history of the area of Sonali, right, where a martial clan of people existed, and their weaponry and their tombs were discovered. But and if we tie that back to education and students actually discovering that history through digital 3D visualization of history, that would be very engaging for them to actually be interested in history as a whole, rather than even a walkthrough of an archaeological space where the only thing they see are ruins, so their imagination is kind of stagnates just there. They don't really
Exactly.
have to. So the digitization would definitely bring forth the imagination and help them engage with the space a lot better. So that's a pretty interesting virtual take on the subject. So speaking of your experience with say temples that you visited and all of that, you are a practicing American Hindu, and as such have despite your absolute patriotism to the US as well, you find a lot of relatability to India still. So that does have something to do with your culture and religion, yes?
I do. Actually, I call myself a global citizen as a whole because can speak some Chinese, red-blooded Texan, spend a lot of time in India as a whole, and so as a whole, I do connect with from the temples, but I connect from a perspective in which you can really see it from a different lens. You see it from a view of the U.S., how the Indian temples in the U.S. are. You see it from a view of maybe Buddhism. You see it from a view of actually in India as a whole. So I do see it. I still connect with it deeply, but I try to see it from a larger, bigger picture perspective, actually.
Could you explain that larger perspective?
So I mean, I see it as a way in which how do you look at it as rationally as possible as a whole, because I do believe that religion and spirituality is important as a whole, because we're all trying to have big goals in life, and that's an important part to incorporate into that, because there's a lot of luck involved as a whole. So that global perspective from a rational point of view of seeing other cultures, other religions form always gives another viewpoint into this.
That's an interesting take. But yeah, I'd love for you to actually visit a lot of these spaces, and maybe uh, if you have any experience with say the texts, the religious texts, whether it's the Puranic texts or the Itihasas or the Vedas, have you been through any of these? Do you find any relevance to everyday life for yourself?
It's something that I've skimmed over, but it's not something I've gone in a lot of detail. So that is a little difficult for me to answer.
All right, no problem. We'll move back to discussing startups before I let you go. In terms of specialized, so to speak, in the logistics, supply chain, etc. Spaces. Um, but in terms of startups and digitization as a whole, so in terms of startups, where do you see the most changes in India happening, and how they affect real world execution, and what more is there to be done, how much more potential is there as a whole in the startup space?
So I think if you look at the startup statistic, everyone knows the statistic quite well. India went from having 6,000 startups and maybe like 5, 6 unicorns in 2015 to having 60 plus unicorns and more 60,000 startups in 2021 as a whole. So we see this revolution happening. The area where I see in India where the startup explosion is really happening is where I still see a lot of potential everyone talks about is the EdTech space. EdTech everyone talks about as is being transformation and all, but I still see a lot of gaps in it because it's all standardized in a way. Everyone will go out and
Right,
produce
right.
education, all the classes are in the same way. So where I see a lot of change happening in EdTech is in EdTech there'll be a huge revolution of customized courses that come out that are built on community building as a whole. So if I say, I'll give you an example of that. So I have signed up for a digital writing course a couple weeks ago. So the course
Mhm.
is only purpose to teach you digital writing and makes you write an essay every single day. So why I think that's such a beautifully integrated startup is because there's a social circle called Circle in which you are interacting with these other writers. There's a writing platform that's integrated with Medium, Twitter, LinkedIn, and then there's a strong area in Twitter where everyone is commenting, giving you a feedback loop as a whole. So this sort of custom value chained course that's built for writing, built for finance, it's built on an engagement because we're constantly talking to people and bouncing ideas off each other, is something that it still doesn't exist for each and every major subject, whether it's history through the metaverse, whether it is finance in which you're talking to the best financial analysts and trying to see on how do you value a stock better, whether it's a digital writing community that bounce ideas off each other. All these custom views of writing of other edtech content is all just waiting to happen. Because I think we're in India where we'll see, because India is so strong in software, I think we'll end up seeing these customized education courses that will come up company to company that will get stronger and stronger because India itself is great at shipping out digital products and building communities for the world as a whole. Because people are getting and consuming more and more content, and that itself is a great feedback loop to go out and create these grade A education powerhouse niches.
So the Coursera and Skillshare model, I think what you just mentioned seems a little more like Skillshare than the Coursera or this more standardized edtech
So,
platform.
so, so I don't. I think those are areas that I think. Pardon me, how I say that. I think those are old models as a whole. They scale up. They give you access to this course. You go out and see. It's a one way. There's no two-way engagement. There's no social circle where you're going out and trying to figure out how does it apply to the real world. Because most of the learning happens when when you're solving practical problems. Really, you have to go out and do something. If you're not solving the problem from day one, I don't think you learn much. And those Coursera courses, they're good and all, but I don't see them really giving that practical knowledge from day one as a whole. That's why they highlight the statistic. A lot of students don't finish the courses as a whole because the engagement levels aren't really there because they're too standardized in a way.
That's a very interesting point. But then to get to these startups where you do have engagement, it does require the economies of scale, right? You have to have a user base that's already large enough to engage in for the newer users, and use that as a forum. So how does that work out in terms of the startups?
So I think that startups that are very, very niche and target very, very specific customer bases. For example, say you target finance only for startup founders, or you target finance only for commercial employees buying paper, something like that. If you can build a social ecosystem, whether it's through Twitter, whether it's something else that has an audience, then you can make that leap as the next step to go out and start a course that does this. I think that to start something like this, you need to have an audience in place first, and then you have the capability to build a course through a system of tech, because the tech is already there. You can build an internalized community. You can build an integrated writing platform, integrated financial platform that already exists. You can go out and have the large-scale mainstream social media place in place. So I think it's an audience first, EdTech later approach rather than EdTech first, audience second approach.
That's a very interesting idea, and I think you're right in terms of executing this. India has a lot of potential, because I know that everybody, once they start having any interest in spaces, you get added to WhatsApp groups, right? And all of these communities are existent in a very informal manner. I am, everybody in India is part of so many interest groups, whether it's business that are women who have sort of started their businesses on WhatsApp with these groups where they're selling saris, or whether they're selling dress material, and then it goes onto the website space. There are interest-based groups. There was one where, there's customer success, there's international relations. All of these groups on Discord and WhatsApp can then evolve into training and education spaces.
Exactly.
Rather than, that's a brilliant idea, I think, and I do hope to see some actual investment and execution in this area. So, if you were to invest in startups at this point, what are the areas that you would pick? What are the sectors that you would pick for your investments? What do you see really well in?
I would pick two areas that I think are the mainstream areas to push into. I would, of course, say EdTech space is red hot. EdTech is right now still really ramping up. So EdTech, where it's audience driven, where you go out and find a great person on Twitter that's just ramping up and has potential to do great writing and build a great course. If you can find a certain founder who's niche, EdTech is a great area when you do course specific. And the other area where I think is investing is that 3D visualization space that I talked about. The 3D visualization engine is hard to build, but from a gaming point of view, everybody needs a strong 3D visualization engine to run your entire new gaming ecosystem that's coming up, restoration, other industries as a whole. So those are the areas where I think are worth looking into as a whole.
I think both of those areas are doing very well already, and in terms of investments, have garnered a lot of investment. But then you are also right in stating that they are, especially the EdTech space, is extremely standardized, and they're trying to follow a template and get their profits in for their investors, and then maybe take it public. So in that sort of in this very fast startup cycle, it's still quite fast, right? I'm not sure that these are legacy businesses. The startup ecosystem in India has been quite strange in that way. There's a lot of attempt in building in a specific hot sector, and then taking the company public, and then we've seen that devolve into a bit of a disaster when it comes to Paytm, and some others, say even Nika, did not do very well. So in that, with those considerations, what do you think about startup space as a whole? Do you see it maturing? Has it hit a plateau? I know we're still doing a lot of foreign investment, and in terms of potential, India as a market is seen as a very, very high potential market still, even by international investors. But do you see the market maturing at a point? Do you see this it's being called a bubble economy again? By several analysts. So do you see that having some detrimental issues?
I think I would take a different take on it. I would say that actually the market will continue to boom. I think India will become the epicenter of startups, actually, because of really one major reason. From a standpoint of building, see, India, most of it is all digital. Everything is a digital product here. That's really how the startup system is being built. The physical setup is relatively less. From a digital infrastructure point of view, India really has it all. Mobile is penetrated like anything. Geo and all 5G is common. Digital workflows are coming up. You can do curation of products through the ecosystem because mobile is there. Software talent is there. Animation talent is there because we all know a lot of the Pixar movies and all use Indian talent. Semiconductor design talent is there. A lot of the semiconductor companies use Indian talent as outsourcing to create design. Beyond that, even the entire ecosystem of EdTech and all is already there that's built such platforms and all. So if you look at it from an infrastructure point of view, there's a lot of this infrastructure that's there to create the next set of digital products, whether it's the next generation memes, whether it's NFTs, whether it's a coin, whether it is a course, whether it's a VR movie. So because I see such a strong digital infrastructure, which you don't have physically, I think we're just getting started. Honestly, I think there is going to be a further boom because no other country in the world has such a strong ecosystem of digital infrastructure, with the exception of probably the US, in place besides India, really. And because we speak English, that itself is a further, I think, value add.
Right. No, all of those points considered, my only contention is that the startup space has seen a lot of very quick investment and investors looking for quick returns. And basically, once they take it public, it does not, I'm not sure that that's the way to go in for building a legacy organization or a business that intends to stay in the space. It just creates a lot of serial entrepreneurs who invest and then move on, take their money out, and move on to different sectors as such. Just invest in the red hot market and then move on to a different market that becomes more trendy at the time. So as such, the real world impact of these startups is do you see that as high as you would like to, or are we just getting started and then do we expect to see that impact actually have some manifestation on ground?
I think from a liquidity point of view, the two main asset classes from a trends point of view that have gone up in the last couple of decades, overcoming the nominal growth and from a real growth point of view, real growth rates, is Bitcoin and the NASDAQ really as a whole. And that's because NASDAQ is all tech. And because there's so much liquidity in the market from a working capital point of view, India's forex reserves are still quite high. I don't know the number right now. And because people have to invest their money somewhere, and non-tech is becoming so much more difficult to invest in, I think people will continue to invest in tech as a whole because it has the highest potential. And with a war for talent ramping up, startups are going to go, and when they make a pitch, they're going to have the talent to go and prove they have the chops to do it as a whole. And because the war for talent is, and some startups have the pitch, people are going to keep investing. If it's a matter of Paytm goes out, and they may be loss-making companies, and they go pitch a great idea, they show the talent, they still believe in the founders with a track record, people are going to invest in them because of the sheer amount of working capital available in the market. I don't see that trend changing.
All right, so we've just got to, hold on to our horses and let them run for now.
Yeah.
And we'll see the impact at a later point. I think in terms of the edtech space, I definitely look forward to the disruptions that you've mentioned, and I hope that it's less standardized as it matures, and
Absolutely.
there's more startups in the space as well. So, all right, edtech aside, do you see fintech evolving as well? Because we've got a lot of startups in the financial tech space as well, sort of bypassing traditional banking systems. We've even got Cred is an organization that's done incredibly well, and they've done it through a lot of inorganic as well as organic growth. So, is fintech another space that you would have any input on?
Fintech will grow because of two reasons, I think. Because one point, I think fintech founders as a whole have a big advantage in the fact they understand finance and they understand technology to start a company. A lot of the non-fintech founders, only what I've seen is they end up struggling because they have not gone out and have a really strong understanding of finance. If you understand finance, well, that's a big advantage because you understand how to manage money, manage working capital to be successful. So fintech itself will continue to grow there. I think from the other perspective, fintech will grow because crypto adoption, I think, will continue to grow in India, despite the challenges of what the government ruling was. I think WazirX, all the other platforms that exist, it'll keep growing as a whole. So fintech will grow because crypto is bound to grow as a whole. NFTs are growing in this space. So all that ecosystem is coming in. So fintech will grow because of crypto.
All right. I think in terms of the other fintechs not dealing with crypto even, so there's a lot of peer-to-peer lending organizations that have come up. And I think that the rapid growth in people banking in India, the rural sectors have just exploded, and especially with the digitization and the UPI payment and the very easy to do KYCs now by all banks. I think the people who are banked, the population that is now banking, formally banking, is very high right now, and I think that's what a lot of fintech startups are also making use of. So yeah, even apart from the crypto space, fintech has done pretty well. And I did work with some startups who were into peer-to-peer lending, but I'm not sure that. Do you have any input on the peer-to-peer lending platforms as well? I'm not sure that there are organizations that have done particularly well in that regard.
No, unfortunately, it's not a space I've explored deeply.
All right. All right. I think those are the questions I have for now. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on this episode, and I definitely look forward to a lot more articles. Also, we'd love to have you discuss your podcast. I think episode 1 releases in next 10 days or something, right?
Absolutely. So the podcast that a co-host and myself are creating is very niche. It's on the security technology space. So we're really gonna go out and give some key takeaways on how security technology is going out and revolutionizing the smart city space and really the industrial space as a whole. So the main areas we cover is we talk about surveillance cameras, how they are going out and going beyond security. They're going and impacting business operations. We talk about drones as they enter the delivery space, as they enter the other spaces, and really talk about how workforce management system and access control has been changed through COVID as a whole. So man tracking, people tracking in cities itself is changing. So it's a niche podcast, but if you are a professional in industry and you want to use security technology to improve business operations, it would be interesting for you to hear because it can really add a lot of value in driving better cash flows and business in your organization.
Well, I definitely look forward to the release, and I will add a link to it once once it's released as well. So your Medium blog in the description box below, because it's got a lot of very interesting ideas, and anybody interested in the startup space in decentralized economies and the metaverse can definitely take a lot from it. So thank you so much for joining us today, Shorjoe, and
Thank you.
have a wonderful day. All
Happy
right,
to be
thank you.
here.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.